Support comes from Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to sustainable and sound conservation of the state's forests, which support more than 41,000 Missouri jobs, resulting in a $10 billion industry. ChooseWood.com.
This is St. Louis on the Air from St. Louis Public Radio. I'm Elaine Cha. In 1492, Columbus sailed an ocean blue. It's a familiar ditty about an explorer landing in what is now the Bahamas, discovering the New World, and setting the stage for a revolution, democracy, and the world we live in today. That is one way to tell the story of America. Author Michael Harriot has a different story. Harriot is a political commentator and columnist for The Griot. His debut book is Black AF History, the Un-Whitewashed Story of America. Since its release, the book has become popular AF, not just a bestseller, but also securing a spot on several year-end lists as one of the best books of 2023. Harriot's book centers the experience of Black people in American history, covering everything from the arrival of Columbus, the streets of Ferguson in 2014, and the election of Donald Trump. In September, before a speaking event at a St. Louis bookstore, Michael Harriot spoke to St. Louis on the Air producer Danny Wysentowski. Michael began by explaining why he decided to tackle such a sweeping retelling of American history.
It was never my goal initially. A lot of people are surprised to find out that my background is as an economist. And I taught a class called Race as an Economic Construct. And one of my positions was that you can't understand the concept of race in America by interrogating or learning about Black people, because Black people didn't create the idea of race. We don't perpetuate white supremacy or racism. You have to study white people. Well, I was right. I had pitched a book called White Peopleology about that specific subject. And then after the deal was closed, the publishers, they didn't like the subtitle of the book about white peopleology because they argued that no one had ever heard of this arcane idea called critical race theory, because the subtitle was Toward a More Critical Race Theory, a subject that I had studied in graduate school. And they said, well, nobody's ever heard of that. Of course, this was 4 years ago, and now everybody's heard of critical race theory. So we decided to flip the order of the book, and thus this book was the first one.
Now, Michael, you are a thinker, you are a writer, you've written for the Griot and many other national outlets, and I wanted to focus on one piece of your word choice here, and it's in the title of your book, and I feel like we should address it. Black AF, that is an acronym that some of our listeners may not be familiar with, and it's a way of describing the degree to which something is black, to be black as, and then there's a word that starts with F that I can't fully say on the radio, and let's just say it rhymes with duck. And I bring this up because this really isn't a throwaway term. You are making an important distinction here. This history isn't whitewashed, but Black AF. What does that mean to you?
So we usually kind of learn history, especially American history, through a white perspective. Well, this book turns that on its side, and it talks about history through the perspective of Black people in America, right? So instead of, one of the things that I point out early is that when we talk about early America, we talk about the Portuguese settlers, we talk about the English colonists, we talk about the Dutch immigrants, and then all of the Black people are just Africans or slaves. All of the indigenous people are just Indians or Native Americans. They don't have a history or a religion or a background or a political motivation, unlike the white people, right? So you can use that same template, but the French, the Dutch, the English, to Black people in America, they were just white people, right? So when you talk about the Revolutionary War, to Black people in America, it was just white people fighting white people. Like, you didn't care about taxation or representation or the tax on tea. So you fought for whichever side was most likely to affect your freedom, because it was just two different kinds of white people fighting, like some dudes in red against some dudes in blue.
Michael, your book has so much of your family in it. You know, your mother, your uncles, the stories of your grandparents. You even write in the voice, I believe, of your uncle, or a person who's named uncle at one point. And it feels very much like a book that lets the reader into your family and, in a way, into your Black history. Is that a vulnerable way to write a book?
I think it is. And I think it is also necessary to understand one of the premises of the book is that there is no objective history. All of the history we learn is subjective, and it's based on how this person who's writing it, the historian or the author, views the world. And I wanted to make people to be sure that, like, you understand that this is the perspective of, it's almost a love letter to the Black people of South Carolina and my family. But that notion of using my family is illustrative of the idea that, oh, I'm not even going to rest on that pretense that this is an objective history, because the white people's version of history, the version that you learned in the social studies book, isn't an objective version either. It was formed by the Daughters of the Confederacy, and ultimately what it leaves out is as important as what it includes. And those are not objective decisions. Those are subjective. Those are based on what the people who are teaching history think is important to understanding America. And a lot of those important values are based on the ideas, or rest in the ideas, of whiteness.
Michael, you were describing your book as a kind of love letter to South Carolina, to your family. And the other word that came to my mind was the cookout. And you actually devote some space in your book to explaining what is a cookout, the way it can be literal, and the way that it also serves as a kind of symbol for the Black community. I'm curious, is this book, with all of its characters and all of your own family members, is this a kind of cookout that you've created in book form?
Yeah, I think so. I think it is relatable. I wanted to talk to Black people in the way that we talk to each other, and the way that we understand each other, and the way that we experience community. And so I wanted to be sure that this book did that. And I also think that there is a familiarity with it, right? So when I write in the voice of my uncle, that's not just like a comedic tool. I want people to understand that a lot of ways, like, we understand our understanding of the external world comes through the people who teach us our values. For me, it was Uncle Rob, and who is my actual uncle, and I interviewed people from my family, and recalled stories of growing up to include in this book, because I wanted it to be relatable.
Right, and you really do a great job of breaking down so much history, so many people, and your book really takes us back, before 1492 even. How did you approach of where to start this history, as far as history can ever have a beginning?
So I wanted to do two things. One, I don't think you can start in America, because the history of Black people does not begin in America. And to understand America and Black people, you have to go to the place, or go to the times when these ideas of, for instance, race-based intergenerational perpetual slavery began. You have to go to the idea of why colonization was so important. You have to go to explain that Black people who were brought to America were not slaves. They were human beings, and scholars and doctors and healers and teachers who were subjected to this form of intergenerational race-based slavery because of how white people saw the world. And I think that's why I didn't think we could start in 1619 or 1492. We had to start, we basically start with the Crusades and the discovery when white people were able to reach West Africa, and Henry the Navigator. And so we start there and go through the history of the Catholic Church's involvement in race-based slavery, and then we go through the significant events that preceded the creation of what we know as America.
And, in that creation story, you introduce us to so many interesting characters and people, and part of the tension there is that Black people existed in this continent, and some of them were even part of these expeditions. And I had a sense from reading that you have a certain fascination for one of them, a guy named Juan Garrido. I had never heard about him before reading the book. Why did he stick out to you so much, looking back at this person who made such an impact and seemed to be so out of place?
Because if you go back to what we just talked about, really, I think it's important to understand that the first Africans in America were not enslaved people. Juan Garrido came here with Ponce de Leon, who thought they were exploring an island that they named La Florida, or Florida. And Juan Garrido was not a slave. He was a Spanish conquistador. He was a African prince, and he was integral in almost every colonization point of Spain in what we call the New World, right? So when he applied for his pension from the Spanish king, he wrote what they call his probanza, or basically like his resume. And he explained to the king, like, you should give me a pension because I was the first person to grow wheat in the Americas. I helped with the conquering of Cuba and Puerto Rico and Mexico, and I discovered La Florida, and I was there at every significant event in the New. Look, when this explorer said he wanted to go to this island where these mythical Black women lived with piles of gold, I went with him and I helped him name that, what he thought was an island. It turned out to be a peninsula called California. So the idea that Black people existed and helped with the origin story of America is important, because again, when you're stripped of that history and that culture and that knowledge and reduced to property as slaves, it's important to know that the American project begins with Black people.
Mm-hmm. This might be a hard question to answer, but is there a particular era of history that is the most whitewashed or the most in need of clarifying? And I guess we could be living in that era right now, but was there one that you did feel like it needed a focus, it needed a clarity?
Yeah, I think the most whitewashed version of history is, gosh, that's a great question. I would think the period of post-emancipation, right? Because we talk about, even when we talk about Reconstruction, we'll talk about the violence, but we don't necessarily talk about the things that Black people built for themselves. That in states like South Carolina and Mississippi, that were majority Black, the Black people created many of the institutions that we know today. For instance, the entire American education system was created by the majority Black constitutional delegation of South Carolina. So a constitutionally enforced school system, mandatory, didn't exist in America before Black people created it. Black people were integral in every form of universal male suffrage that existed, from Maine at the beginning, before there was an America, to after the Civil War. Every time black people got the chance, we said, let everybody vote. And the institutions that we built during Reconstruction that were largely destroyed during the violence and the terrorism, the idea that the violence during Reconstruction were individual acts and not a national campaign of state-sponsored terrorism that actually overthrew the country. We don't understand it in that way because it has been whitewashed.
You know, there is a vibe with this book at times that feels like a bit like a school textbook. Your chapters, they include these multiple choice questions at the ends, 3 little questions they're called, or just activities. And, you know, for instance, one of them, the activity is, you are tasked with creating a humane system of enslavement that will not cause your human chattel to escape, revolt, or otherwise resist. In 1 million words or fewer, describe this system. So this feels like a bit of a joke. You know, you're making a point here, but you're also exposing some of the absurdity. Another activity you include is construct a racially equitable education system. No, not on paper, do it in real life. What were you thinking in adding these activities? Is this a bit of levity, or is there an importance to pointing out some of the contradictions here, or the notion that these subjects can be boiled down into simple summary questions with easy answers at the end?
I think it's a little bit of both, right? So I think there is levity to it, and I wanted to make this like a textbook with unit reviews and test questions and quizzes. And I also use those things to expose some of the notions that we have about history, right? So, you know, I'll ask questions like, hey, what is a white person? Is it a French person from Haiti, right? Or is it a Spanish person from Mexico? Or is it a African who lived in France before? So dismantling the idea of whiteness, dismantling the idea of race, to show us how we subconsciously accept these predetermined notions of white supremacy and how they're embedded in our textbooks and the way we understand history, was a goal of those questions at the end of the chapter.
That was author Michael Harriot. In September, he spoke to St. Louis on the Air producer Danny Wicentowski about his new book, Black AF History, The Un-Whitewashed Story of America. We need to take a quick break, but we'll be back shortly to continue this conversation. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, providing more than 41,000 jobs in the production of wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details at choosewood.com.
Welcome back. We're listening back to a September interview with political commentator and columnist Michael Harriot. He became a debut author in 2023, releasing Black AF History, The Un-Whitewashed Story of America. St. Louis on the Air producer Danny Wicentowski interviewed Harriot before a public speaking event in St. Louis.
Michael, before the break, we were talking about the way that you had built this book as a kind of textbook. But you also cover a lot of recent events, not just the distant history. And one of those events are the protests in Ferguson. Those, of course, occurred after the August 9th, 2014 killing of Michael Brown. He was shot and killed by Officer Darren Wilson. You were there during the protests on the ground. And we are all now kind of preparing for the 10th anniversary. And we just marked the 9th. What are you reflecting on at this point when you're thinking about Ferguson now that we're almost a decade later?
I am thinking about the uprising. I am thinking about how Ferguson exposed the to America's, and not just the killing, because we reduce it to the killing of Michael Brown, but what we eventually learned, and what I talk about in my book, was that the systemic issues that created the atmosphere that led to the killing of Michael Brown, the police state that these communities live in, the way that they were basically impoverished by the system that they funded. And I think that is important to know, that these random incidents aren't just random incidents. They are created through systemic issues that we also have to fix, because it's not just a single racist police officer. It is the systems that enable these activities to continue to exist.
Michael, you introduce Ferguson in a chapter that really overall grapples with the idea of nonviolent protest and resistance and the contrast between those two. Did Ferguson change how you viewed that difference?
I think in a large part it did. I think that I've always believed that in understanding a whitewashed version of history, we believe things that are never true, like the nonviolent civil rights movement, which it was not nonviolence. The white people were plenty violent. And the idea that black people achieved civil rights through a method or a strategy that never existed in the known world, right? The way America was through violence and bloodshed. The way we ended slavery was through violence and bloodshed. The way, even Jesus came here and knew he had to die. Like, there was no progress in this world or in the history of this country that we achieved without violence, except we have whitewashed the civil rights movement to make people believe that black people held hands and sang a few freedom songs and achieved civil rights, when that is not what happened. And so Ferguson is instructive in seeing this, because it shows us that I don't know if we would have ever known or had this robust conversation about police brutality since then if it hadn't been violent.
On that topic of the nature of violence, and in the Ferguson protests, you describe this really powerful encounter you had in August 14, and you write about how there was a young man who was near you, and you write about how you clenched the rock-tossing hand of a 19-year-old kid who you had just met, and you're trying to convince him not to be the first one to throw that rock, and the way the media will present this, and the way they'll call everyone at the protest thugs, and at the end of that, someone else throws a rock, and of course that is how that protest is described, as turning violent, as having thugs, and not as contending with the bigger issues, with the death of Michael Brown, the systemic issues you've just pointed out. You bring up that incident in a way that makes me wonder if you've reflected on that, or if you've been wrestling with what you had done, or if you would do the same thing today if you were in the same position. How do you feel about that incident, and would you do something different?
I think I might have been reluctant to even try to stop it, because I understand that in understanding history, the people who fight for their rights, especially if they are black, will always be made into the villains. We saw it with Black Lives Matter. We saw it with Martin Luther King. We saw it with the civil rights movement, who were called communists. We saw it with the Red Summer, the anti-lynching activists who were called Un-American. We see it throughout history, that the people, especially black people, are never going to be seen in a positive light, no matter how nonviolent or compliant they are. So there is no need to try to perpetuate this idea of goodwill for a people who have never experienced the goodwill of this country. You might as well fight for your rights.
And that's basically what the kid told you back, as you recount in the book. When you're expressing your concern to him, what are people going to write about this if you throw that rock? He responds, like that stuff matters. Can't you see they're going to kill us anyway? It sounds like he was already on the page you're on now.
Yeah, I think he was probably had made farther down the road in that idea than I was. But I think that it is also a lesson in how I came to understand what people experience and how protests are about desperation. Like, we've asked for this in every imaginable way possible. And like, it's almost a mirror instance. It's almost reflective of what the Declaration of Independence is, right? Just think about the words of the Declaration of Independence. They basically said, in every way possible, we've pleaded with King George for our rights. And now we are left with this, right? We declare our independence. We're going to have to fight now. And we look at what Black people do as different from what America does, when it is all the same desperation and the right to freedom that we are all fighting for.
Michael, after the Ferguson protests, you reported on the protest that broke out in 2017. That was when, the end of a murder trial involving a police officer named Jason Stockley. He had shot and killed a man named Anthony Lamar Smith in 2011 and was brought up on murder charges. Stockley was eventually acquitted, and you covered these protests just as you had done in Ferguson. And in your writing, you wrote about this a bit in an interesting way. You described St. Louis as kind of like an orca, a killer whale, and that it might not be fair, it might not solve the problem, but whenever a community of people finally decide to stand up to get their oppressors, no matter how bloody, ugly, or out of control it may get, it's kind of beautiful, actually. And you said, St. Louis is the whale. Talk about what you meant there, that beauty and what you saw. Was that something that you had carried over from Ferguson, this understanding, or did something change about those Stockley protests in 2017 that elicited that really, very pointed kind of imagery?
Yeah, I think it is something that it kind of evolved into the beauty that I see, because when the origin story of that is that I was working as a substitute teacher once, and this little kid told me that he was at the famous SeaWorld incident when the killer whale attacked one of the workers at SeaWorld. And I later saw that little kid in Ferguson, right, years later. And when he said the killer whale attacked the woman, he said it was kind of beautiful. As a little kid, he said, no, it was kind of beautiful, actually. Well, what is a protest besides a desperate attempt to gain one's freedom? And when we see those fires burning, when we see those people unite in a Declaration of Independence, it's kind of beautiful to me. It is kind of the essence of what we believe America is. This unquenchable desire for freedom, to believe that one is a human being, to demand one's humanity be taken into account, is a beautiful thing to me. And even though there's blood sometimes, it is still a thing of beauty.
Michael, with a kind of last question here, your book makes so many powerful cases about the way that Black people are the reason why we even have a democracy, the reason why the Constitution has amendments. So many critical roles they've played without getting the same sort of historical highlight as everyone else. And I'm wondering, are there Black AF moments from Missouri or St. Louis history that you would want to leave our audience with that may have also been undercut or overshadowed by these other forms of history?
Well, there are a lot of them. When we think about the state of Missouri was formed out of the interest in ending race-based slavery, from Ferguson to all of these protests. But I think one of the things that we can learn about the history of Black people through Missouri is that when Black people were emancipated, or when we emancipated ourselves, we went to these places like what became St. Louis to get away from oppression and to form our own communities and exist in self-determination. And so what we call the Great Migration, this move to the Midwest, is part of Black people's desire for freedom. And I think that the history of Missouri and the history of St. Louis, we see that throughout its history. And I think that that is instructive to knowing the history of Black people.
That was political commentator and columnist Michael Harriot, author of the new book, Black AF History, The Un-Whitewashed Story of America. St. Louis on the Air producer Danny Wicentowski interviewed Harriot in September.
This episode was produced by Danny Wicentowski.
Podcast design by Aaron Dorr.
Our executive producer is Alex Hoyer.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
St. Louis on the Air proudly supports local artists by using music from Life Creative Group.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations, and leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thank you.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to conservation and careful management of the state's forests to make them more resilient and better habitats for wildlife. ChooseWood.com.